Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show with another interesting episode today. You're going to love this. First off, I always have a great time co-hosting with Sandra Ponce De Leon. She is the co-producer also on this episode, and she brings us Robert Jacobson, who's written a book called Space is Open for Business. Now look, a lot of people laugh at the Space Force concept. President Trump brought it together, and they're like, haha, giggle, giggle. The thing is, and a lot of you know from listening to Megan from Mars, that episode from Meghan Kane, and by the way, look in the show notes for Meghan Kane's episodes, space is open for business. People are really doing this. There's companies looking at investing. There's already companies up and doing it. There are people provisioning space companies. So think about this. There is a lawyer for space. There is a broker for space, for things going to space. There are people that handle multinational legal issues, international space issues, all kinds of things. There's companies working on how do we get to asteroids and bring back some of those rare metals that are hard to get here and stop damaging the earth. And then there's also people like, hey, we have to also protect the environment out in space. We can't just go out and start knocking all these rocks around and smash them into bits and bring them back to pieces, because we actually have to preserve some of the natural beauty of space. And so there's advocates for the, I guess you would call it the environment of space. All of these things exist. And so it's guys like Robert Jacobson that are helping us to understand just what this is going to look like as we become a species that can move around the solar system, at least robotically, if not with also human power. Anyhow, I know you're going to love it because it's just fascinating. There's a zillion questions and you have to read the book. It's so interesting. Like if you think Space Force is a joke, if you think, space is just space, read the book and you're just going to be amazed at all of the advancement that's happened even in the last 20 years. I mean, it is truly, truly, truly incredible. So Robert Jacobson. Hey, real quick, the Save the Brave rifle raffle is still going on. Go to blackstonearms.com and buy a raffle ticket, $100 a piece. The rifle is a $5,000 value rifle. You can do it, you can buy it, or you can just donate. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, put a small amount of money in each month, or you can donate a one-time donation. The other day, someone donated a boat. No fooling. You can donate land, you can donate stock shares, whatever you've got. You're looking around thinking, hey, you know what I've got here? I've got this old boat. Maybe these guys can use it. Okay, great. I've got something. Hey, maybe we can use it. Okay, great. Let's do it. Let's figure out how to do that. Okay, enough about all that stuff. Thank you all so much for your support. Continue to click on the subscribe button. I can't tell you how much that helps. I see the numbers going up, so thank all of you who do that. There are so many people from India now listening to the show. What up, India? We love you guys. All right, here we go. Here comes Robert Jacobson.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Robert Jacobson, and you're watching the Break It Down Show live.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes, live indeed. I love it. And one of my favorite people is joining me as co-host and co-producer. She put it all together. So I'm going to let Sandra do some talking, and I'm going to sit back and try to look good.
Oh, thank you, Pete. Well, it's always wonderful to join you again. And I just love the conversations that we have together. And it's so great to have Robert here. We're going to be talking all about the business of space. Robert is an expert in that. And I'm especially interested in the planetary impact of space and how we can use our space explorations to better impact systems on Earth. So I'm going to let Robert give us an introduction, and I really want to hear about your story, which I find also fascinating, about how you got into the space industry to begin with.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Hi, everyone, and hi, Pete. Thank you very much for having me today. Again, I'm Robert Jacobson. So the brief story was I grew up in the long shadow of the space shuttle, which for me was in the state of Florida. And I thought I would become a NASA astronaut as a kid. It's those things. You're child and astronaut, firefighter. There was probably something else in that vein. And as I got a little older, I went to space camp, and it was awesome. And I thought, this is the track that I want to be on. And then someone sort of shared to say, well, you probably need to go into the go to the U.S. Air Force Academy or have some sort of military experience or get a and that didn't really resonate with me. And it was immediately like, nah, I don't think I want to do that. I want to head and do other things. So I still loved space. I went to do other things. And in school, I actually studied music and business, kind of separate tracks. But I had this deep love for things that were entrepreneurial and music. And the space thing was always just kind of an interest, but nothing really more than that. And much, much later, I ended up going to the first flight to space by Spaceship One, which for the audience perspective was the first private space flight or first privately funded space flight to space. Now, the edge of space, there's an actual boundary that scientists call the Kármán line, named after a guy named von Karman, and it's about 62 miles above sea level or 100 kilometers above your head. Now, I think if you were at 60 miles, it would probably look and feel like space, but essentially they've sort of said 62 miles is the boundary of space. So on June 21st, 2004, as part of the Ansari X Prize, the Burt Rutan led team flew Spaceship One to the edge of space. And I was there in person to witness it. And It just really changed everything for me. I knew I was witnessing a historical event. And there were so many different types of people present there in Mojave, California that day. I said, I've got to be a part of this. I'm not sure how. And that's essentially was the catalyst for where I am today. So it was sort of unpredictable and maybe it wasn't a linear path, but that's essentially how it occurred.
They talk about how astronauts have that effect when they look down at the Earth. Did you have that? I mean, I think it's called the after effect, or what is it? Did you sense that?
The overview effect.
The overview effect. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm actually that was a term created by the author Frank White. He's becoming and has been. Maybe an informal. He's both an inspiration, and informal mentor to me. And I'm actually currently reading one of his newest books, and it's right here called The Cosmi Hypothesis, which is an excellent read by Frank. And I did not necessarily have the overview effect because I wasn't looking at the Earth. The overview effect is that feeling of connectedness you have when you're looking at the Earth without seeing any artificial boundaries. And, maybe it's a feeling of connectedness, or some people say spirituality. There's a lot of different qualities that one might experience with it. But what I think I felt, well, I did feel some connectedness, like this was a very human thing. We were all celebrating. It was a celebration, also something powerful. And then just for me personally, it was a little selfish. I was just like, oh my gosh, I want to be a part of this. I mean, I think we all felt a part of it that day, but that you get a little bit of like this ego sensitivity that you just feel like, I want to do this. I want to be a part of this. And I think that's one of the cool things about space is it does have a lot of inspirational qualities.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had Rory Kennedy on the show, and she did a documentary about, space and the atmosphere and the environment. And that kind of goes along with the theme. And every single astronaut that she talked to had this connection of like, when you look back and you realize just how thin the atmosphere is and how fragile the Earth is in this big hostile existence, it struck all of them throughout the movie. They kept talking about it. And it's interesting when we look out to space that we end up looking right back and thinking about the environment and the ocean and things that matter to all of us. We're actually going to release our episode next week with Fabien Cousteau, who talks about the ocean and how like it's so vital for creating oxygen, for that we breathe every day. And there is no, he was talking about like when you live in a space station or a rocket ship or whatever it is, that, there is no throwing something away. Like it all goes somewhere, and that doesn't change on the Earth. Like you use a plastic something, just because it leaves your immediate presence doesn't mean that it's not sitting somewhere holding up space and, doing what it does.
I hear you and Fabian's sentiments. I'd read somewhere that one of the Apollo astronauts who was on the moon had a realization that when he was looking back at Earth and could basically put his hand or thumb in front of it and cover it up and realize that just about every memory, physical thing, everything that humanity had pretty much ever done was all self-contained right there in this thing that he could cover up with his, I don't know if it was thumb or his hand, which is kind of mind-blowing. And as we have more regular people, and I think that includes people that are, different genders, different nationalities, different races, different types of politicians. I think it was a big deal when John Glenn went back to space. He was an astronaut, then he turned to being a senator. We've had a few of these kind of honorary space flights for people that maybe who weren't fitting the typical profile, whether it was because their age or occupation went to space, and they still come back and they're just like, this is an amazing thing. I remember the Cirque du Soleil founder, and I butcher his name because I don't speak French, but I think it's Guy Labière, the creator of Cirque du Soleil or co-founder of Cirque du Soleil. His big inspirational project, I think it's called something One Water. I don't remember his philanthropic organization, but it's around clean water. And he did this project on the space station, teaching and connecting more about clean water on the Earth through his visit to the space station. And so I think there's no shortage of inspirational projects that we can do here on Earth as both or in space to connect us better. And I think maybe one thing that people can start thinking about today is just instead of thinking ourselves as just as citizens of planet Earth or passengers on Earth, but it is a spaceship that is flying through the solar system. So we need to think of ourselves as citizens of this solar system. And that's sometimes a little difficult to get our head around, but we are part of this greater solar system. And as we expand further, we will have a responsibility to be good stewards.
Yeah, well, we're definitely failing in our good stewardship here on Earth. But I'd love to, kind of just up until very recently, I think I had a pet peeve about all these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and billionaires that are going and spending a bunch of money, $1 billion here or $20 billion to build a space colony on Moon, or trying to get us to Mars, when really there's so much need here on Earth. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because my opinion has been shifting, but I just want to for the naysayers out there that think that space exploration is maybe just something that is only available or is at the whim of a rich billionaire that just wants to do that to satisfy his own ego, let's say. What are some of the advantages of, or what are some of the things that we can learn in space that we can't learn here on Earth, or that can help us on Earth?
Yeah, so can we let's talk about today. Let's talk about today current things of the positive impacts. And I'm going to use a list today that was just kind of as a cheat sheet, culminated from one of my friends, and he's kind of an informal space mentor of mine. I had invested in a past company of his, a man named Jeff Grayson. He really puts a lot of things into perspective for me, and he's a contributor to my book, Space is Open for Business. So Earth observation, and what does that mean? We have satellites, which are essentially unmanned spacecraft that fly around the Earth. Some are really little and some are quite large, school bus size, to things that are even almost the size of a cell phone. And they're observing the Earth. Even spy, when you think of the word spy satellite, what is a spy satellite? It basically has a big telescope on it, allows us to see the Earth really well. And there's different types of these Earth observation satellites. Some of them have sensors they can look at. They can look in the hyperspectral. They're looking at other parts of the light spectrum. Some are looking at the visual spectrum. Some are using radar. And so some of the positive uses for them today are from weather prediction and climate monitoring. Really important as we try to develop faster, more detailed, better ways to understand of the climate, both at a micro and macro. Without these assets in space, we're talking about really lives at stake. Really important. And it's also kind of interesting that for a long time, specifically the United States would use weather data as a form of diplomacy. And they still continue to provide weather free to other nations. So what's sort of happening new is there's now some new commercial models of weather coming on board, where groups are going to be able to sell more granular data or different types of weather data to both governments and maybe private organizations, like other companies which will want to understand weather better. Also, our allocation of resources in terms of our resource management, or sometimes mismanagement in terms of agricultural production, freshwater, forestry, fisheries, can all be monitored. And also the illicit activities can be monitored, from poaching fires, illegal mining. Another current way is space communications. Think of the telecom industry. We have these big satellites that sit out at Lagrange points, which essentially are places between, say, the Earth and the Moon, where basically that satellite's not moving. So it can track the Earth. So if it's tracking North America, it can provide communications and television and radio services. So there's we use those all the time. We have a GPS, which allows us for navigation and timing. We use, whether you're using a ride sharing app, a logistics app, just a regular map to figure out where you're at, GPS is an important component to it. The space sector hires lots of people, both in government and outside of government, universities, laboratories, private industry. And this investment in space has been proven to basically return back positive amount of dollars. It's been very healthy for the economy. It's very inspiring in terms of kids that want to get into STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, math area disciplines, because having a literate society that can think rationally is I believe highly important. There's a few others I can share, including we get spin-offs, direct
The list
spin-offs.
goes on and on.
It goes on and on. And here's an important one people don't think about. We've got the International Space Station, which is an international effort. And in a time where we have so much tension between different countries, the International Space Station was an amazing way to have cooperation between different nations and helping alleviate some of the tension. And I think if we continue to have more cooperative or friendly engagement between nation states for space development, it's gonna help potentially things where there's maybe natural proclivities to being suspicious of the other side or resentful or whatever else. So I think it helps inspire collaboration. Does that hopefully give you a few, Sandra?
Yeah, just a few.
That collaboration on the space station, that goes back a long way, and we only just barely got there. It still took like the US adding in extra money and, really kind of like encouraging internationally, like all of the participants to bring what they ultimately could bring. But you're right. It is maybe the greatest humanitarian experiment outside of, the Earth proper,
I actually think the space station is as important as the pyramids, just as a physical structure. It took a long time, a lot of resources, very complicated. It's amazing. Now, a couple of things that are working against it is it costs a lot of money every year to maintain. And every year it's slowly sinking because it's just a few hundred miles up above sea level. And it's just not sinking, but, falling towards the Earth. So they constantly have to boost it. And that takes fuel and money for the fuel to keep it orbited. So there is it will probably eventually get decommissioned or parted up. I personally would love to see, used to its maximum life. And if they can even pull off maybe pieces of it and turn it into an orbital museum, because it would be a little bit sad for me to see them just burn it up, because they spent over $100 million in capital expenditure to build it, just to kind of throw it away. If we sort of said, well, we want to build a series of condos where we're in Giza, that would be a little sad. So, you come visit it on VR.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think that there will be someday just tourist travel to the space station? Do you see that in our futures, in our lifetime?
So it's already happened in a very limited way with the people who've paid tens of millions of dollars on up to go on these flights. But besides costing a lot, having a high price point, they had to spend several months training. Many times, part of that time they just spend it in Russia. So that's not really appropriate for most of us. But there are companies now that are already building right now flight hardware. Initially, there's sort of two models. One that'll be completely independent of the space station, with the intention of flying non-professional astronauts, both tourists and maybe you could say, a country wants to just fly their own astronaut outside of like contracting with a space agency. And then there is a project, or it's a company called Axiom, which is building a facility which will initially attach a node to the International Space Station. Eventually, it'll become its own independent one. And and space tourism is part of their market. And I think they're doing their first flight to the space station within a couple of years. And as companies, these launch companies keep reducing the cost, it could be affordable for most of us within our lifetimes to have a direct space experience.
Wow.
Or
That's cool.
in space experience, excuse me.
Mhm.
That's crazy. I was thinking, so Sandra and I did a show in Popping the Bubble with my friends over at Spire, and they put CubeSats up into low Earth orbit, and they have a constellation. And one of the byproducts of this business model was they learned that they could sell data to NOAA, who never thought they would need private data ever because, they're already NOAA, they're already doing these things. But just by getting the satellites up and, having the capability of answering the what if questions, like, well, why don't we just put a module on for testing that? All of these new things have arisen, like the ability to look at the Earth and whether, in almost like an MRI, where like the entire thing's a system and you can slice different segments out and understand it. What kind of things are out there that maybe we don't know that have happened in just a few years since we did that show? What's evolved?
So Peter, who started
Right.
Spire Global, he's a personal friend, and I remember when Peter first was pitching Spire, it was actually a very different model. It was called, this is just a piece of trivia now, Nano Satisfy, and he was actually sharing this idea. He sort of was pitch, and I saw the pitches early on. It was an iTunes for space, and what he was sort of thinking, he was thinking about a store that would have applications of which developers would put their applications. The applications would be space related that you could sell. And these applications would go on a satellite. So maybe somebody would say, I'm building an application to track cargo ships. I'm tracking a ship to do weather or whatever. That was what he initially was pitching. He pivoted to essentially then saying he was going to build his own satellites and also create software in this big platform. The products and services are now becoming available. I would say it's early days. Maybe say several years ago, it was above experimental. It was still early stage. We're just getting to now where some of these platforms are becoming operational, where it's relatively easy for non-space businesses to buy the data sets or say, this is our problem. We don't care where the data comes. We don't care whether it comes from a drone or a satellite. We just need intelligence behind it. That's probably a lot where that's a lot where the value is, because hardware is expensive. So we're still seeing the needs in terms of applications, in terms of environmental. You have a lot of investment managers, hedge fund people are very interested in seeing things like they're interested in activity movement, whether it's at a human scale or larger, and from space where they can track these things in a temporal way, saying, oh, this was here, it took so many days to get here, or this thing remained stationary here, and they're basically looking for pattern changes. And there's other companies out there. There's Planet, and there's many others that are working in this domain, essentially using the domain of space to kind of measure this potential patterns of change, because our world is changing both. The natural environment changes and the human element changes. You could be maybe you're an urban planner and you can use space assets to see like, okay, how quickly, how many swimming pools are there in this area, or looking at water usage or watering lawns. I'm just change detection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of leads into your book a little bit, right? And the business of space and the fact that there is $1 trillion market opportunity there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So space currently is represented as a $350 billion a year global economy. And, whether it's 300, 350, these things, it changes. And space is kind of funny in a sort of way where they're always very proud that if they can find something that's connected to space, they're like, okay, we can throw that in there. But you don't necessarily hear about other industries that are like, the semiconductor industry or truck industry that says, and it's not necessarily a competence thing. Space is still trying to, in some ways, justify itself to communities outside of space, because it is a very useful area, but sometimes it doesn't. The space industry sometimes struggles at telling this story. So the story I was trying to share is that $1 trillion is just like it's a convenient way to get people excited, but space could be almost the infinite business plan that could allow our species and our civilization and our planet to thrive better, and for us and when I say all of us, if we choose to have an even higher standard of living than we enjoy today. So it's difficult to imagine with, especially the challenges that we're currently experiencing, and will continue to feel the pressures of around things like human-caused climate change. But if we in a smart way leverage space, we are going to be able to enjoy economic and social and technology advantages that we can't necessarily imagine yet. And there's I'll just talk about like something related to the viruses. So we're dealing with this pandemic around the time of this recording of COVID-19. There's been some viral research in microgravity, but I don't think a ton. And I was looking a little bit at it, and I found out that one area, the interesting thing is the herpes virus. They have found that some astronauts who had it, and we become like a government an astronaut. They know everything, almost everything about you. And they found with many of these astronauts, this herpes virus will get reactivated in microgravity. Why? I don't know. That's not my expertise, but they're looking at it. And there's an interesting company that's called Space Pharma. They're an Israeli-based company, and there's other companies in this area. But essentially, what they're doing is they're building platforms to build experiments. So build a little spacecraft, a satellite, and they can put pharmaceutical and life science experiments on that and test it in space. They're also doing this on the space station. There's a lot of really fascinating and useful work when you start taking these biological experiments into space. And we're just scratching the surface, because the space station in some ways was an undertapped resource. For a long time, the astronauts who were there were glorified janitors. And then we had everything kind of was set in such a way where the astronauts had more capacity to do science every week. So we have both things happening in an automated way and where astronauts have to go and do something to the experiment. But I think as you're going to start seeing once we start seeing breakthroughs in whether it's manufacturing, pharmaceutical and life sciences, materials research, energy research from microgravity, you're going to start seeing all these other existing companies and organizations saying, wait, how can we do that? I want that. I want that capability too.
Yeah.
So space is going to be this, it's going to be this business plan that we're going to have for generations. We're just at the very, very tip of this. So I talk about, towards the end of the book, the steps that we can enable to sort of create a sustainable economy that'll benefit Earth to get us to that sort of $1 trillion place within a decade. But I essentially think it's a place that we can almost have virtually, talk about numbers in like a quadrillion. We've never done anything really in quadrillions. But as soon as you start thinking about the resources of space, and it's not unlimited because there's only so many things in the solar system, and I actually talk a bit about that in my book, that we actually should set aside about 7/8 of the solar system as wilderness. There was a paper written that I quote in the book, that they looked at how much of the solar system we should set aside as wilderness. And they actually measure and essentially said about 7/8. And you're like, oh man, well, that's not much. Like, if I'm a greedy capitalist, I want more. Well, not really. You can actually, like, with that 1/8, we apparently have enough like iron ore in the solar system for like hundreds and hundreds of years. And as our own technology advances, we get more efficient and more optimized. So there's really, space makes us smarter. It makes us do things better and smarter on Earth. I sometimes feel for the naysayers, they need to just get over that little hurdle of just stop looking at the rocket nozzle and only thinking that it's space. Start thinking about space, Earth, all this as a really interconnected ecosystem, and we're kind of taking little baby steps at the moment.
When we had Megan, who used to work at Spire, and she's on the track to become one of the Martians. I don't know if you know Megan or not, but
what is Megan's last name?
Mars.
Okay. She's going to Mars. Okay.
She is, yeah,
Megan the Martian.
Yeah, but yeah, she's been at this for a while. She worked at Spire early on. She was, at Space U, and I'm not joking about this for the audience. She was at Space U with Peter.
You mean International Space University?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And we were talking about like things like Space Force and how like we like to mock it because President Trump came up with it. But we have these international organizations and treaties, and to manage the Earth, we have to have some kind of overriding entity that holds us all accountable, because we have a G7, a G5, a G8, a G20. We can't even get everybody on board with the same program. And space is sort of like that. So to have these entities out there to start to marshal these resources, to protect that 7/8, to keep it from being militarized, all of these things have to happen. And that seems like that would reflect back on the Earth too, in our ability to say, if we have this requirement for stewarding space, by not just leaving our junk up there, cleaning up what the junk is up there, that maybe we can bring that kind of authority into our oceans, into our atmosphere as well.
I was also kind of thinking the other way around, Pete.
Okay.
What are the lessons that we've learned here on Earth that we need to make sure that, we're acting responsibly when we go out into space, and, all of these satellites that are going up there, what is that creating in terms of space garbage?
Yeah.
So the space garbage in orbit, they call it, like the official name, they call it orbital debris, is an important issue. And it's difficult right now, but it hasn't been at the place where space can't operate. But the experts in this area, they contend that we'll probably have another accident sometime, let's just say within the next 5 years. And then, unfortunately, because our species tends to be very reactive, then they'll start trying to figure out how to do something. There are a lot of great early stage efforts, both on the private and nonprofit side, around reduction of it, mitigation, prevention of it, recycling things in space. But it's also, there's not enough resources for it. But it is happening. There was just, I think, another announcement for another. I don't know the name of the company. It was a new one to me, but I just saw a headline this morning about another company that's trying to look at dealing with orbital debris. And one other area that was mentioned about the Space Force, some are contending that we should task Space Force as part of their responsibilities to being in part in charge of dealing with potential objects that could essentially collide with the Earth, like near Earth asteroids. They've measured that there's about 20,000 asteroids and objects out there in space that could potentially hit us. There's probably more. And we need better monitoring because one's going to hit us. One hit Russia a few years ago and caused a lot of damage. And if we identify one of these that's probably going to hit the Earth and say, wow, there's a good chance it could take out New England, Southern California,
oh my God,
the middle of the US, they're going to find the financial resources basically to take care of it. In a group like Space Force, or call it the Space Guard, maybe modeled more after a Coast Guard type of model, would probably be a smart way to deal with that. But this is, you've got political jockeying, you've got all the other stuff. And things like Space Force weren't necessarily purely, it's not like somebody just woke up and created a tweet about it. I promise you, there been a lot of discussion around these things, both in DoD and outside of DoD for a long time. And it's kind of these stories and papers and policy ideas that eventually then get to the door of an executive at maybe in this case at the White House, and then they sort of say, okay, we're going to actually do something. Now, it all could change if you have the whole space policy could change with a change in the presidency, but there's at least enough momentum in the private sector and the collaboration in terms of commercial agreements, essentially agencies like NASA buying from the private sector, where I don't think a lot of things, not all of it, is going to get necessarily derailed because of a potential change in the presidency.
I was going to say, just to add to your point, Pete, I mean, is there a regulatory or ethical body that is overseeing this to make sure that we are acting responsibly in space? And is there, or is it just a free for all?
Complicated question. So some of the answer is there is this. So the United Nations has groups that meet. It's called COPUS, UN COPUS, I think. It's like the Committee for Outer Space, something of COPUS. You could look it up. They meet often in like places like Austria and like to discuss these sorts of like big macro issues. There are space treaties. Some of them have been signed to, some have been not. Right. They're kind of tricky there. Some are a little bit outdated and were like developed. You look at the timing of when they were developed. They were like developed during the U.S. Soviet Cold War. They're not There's parts of them that don't make as much sense in 2020. You then have here in the United States, so you have like FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and they handle things like launch licenses. But technology in some of these commercial efforts are outpacing governments and agencies. And you can probably look at anything, whether it's the post office and you can look at any agency in the government, and there's probably somewhere in the private sector where they're just running circles around the government, and the government is trying to figure it out. So government is trying to make things more efficient and adopt practices from private industry, like having web-friendly ways to do contracting and to monitor launch or to get your license, because you have to have a license to launch your rocket. You have to have then you have to actually then go to an international body. And this is going back, Sandra, I'm not trying to wave off. I'm trying to answer this in a holistic way. But like if your satellite communicates to the ground, which it probably needs to, you have to then go to an international body to get spectrum licensing. And you have to get licensing from wherever your satellite is domiciled, so say the United States. So you got to go to the FCC in an international body to get that licenses. So there's all these sorts of things that maybe you could look at this as regulatory and tax. The ethical part, not so much. Oh, and in the United States, the Commerce Department now has a group within it that's woefully under budgeted, or is called the doing space commerce. They're doing a great job, but woefully underfunded. And there are groups, and it's actually some great discussion points that Frank makes, and I'm totally pitching Frank. Frank's awesome in this book, where he suggests that we need these international groups to address. They're like task forces to start directly addressing environmental, ethical issues. So one, if they're curious, can find lots of essays and policy papers and sort of like the thought pieces, which are good to engender this into this zeitgeist. But there's not really on there's no agency for, say, ethics. I mean, granted, I think we need a Department of Ethics just probably just on a federal level, but I digress there.
Yeah, the ethical decisions. And the other day I had an ethicist on the show, and someone got mad at her ethics on the show. So as soon as we bring ethics in, it gets a little bit crazy.
I seen the live chat. Remco Timmermans, who's a professor when I was at the International Space University, and he's a great guy, and he runs a great social media agency focused on space stuff. He actually commented in the chat, and it's UNCOPUS. Some people call it COPUS, so people can look it up in terms of the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And then there's a committee within it called UN-NUSA, UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, based in Vienna, Austria. Thank you very much, Remco. And there's some, I don't know if there's questions, but I definitely see some comments in the live comments. So
yeah, we'll try to get through those. The conversation is interesting. One of the things too, that if we don't have a big knowledge on space, you don't realize that like a company like Spire or whoever it is, SpaceX, they are answering questions and legal things and physically possible things all the time. Combinations of emails coming in, and you're like, no one in the history of humankind has ever had this particular problem. Now, who do we know? Do we need to go to U.S. Commerce? Do we need to go to, this country's this? I mean, we're launching rockets out of Russia, all these different places where you've got to check the blocks. There's actually lawyers for space now, like where they just focus on compliance. And there's a broker for space, for going to space, where they're like, hey, there's a launch going up, and we've got this much space for ballast. Even that's how Spire used to get their rockets up, and they would just throw them out, or their satellites up. They would just throw it out with the trash almost, So all these incredibly, like, we think about the sexy stuff of going out and attaching a drill to a meteor, but there's really going to be a person they are the legal representation for going to space, for finding space in space. All these things are all coming, and they're these secondary and tertiary markets. Talk a little bit about some of those things if you can.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Like, we think about the sexy stuff of going out and attaching a drill to a meteor, but there's really going to be a person they are the legal representation for going to space, for finding space in space. All these things are all coming, and they're these secondary and tertiary markets. You don't think about there being a broker for space to get to space, to buy these things, right? And then the legal compliance to
Yes.
do something. Like, China wants to potentially put a second moon in the sky, legitimately. I'm not making this up.
Oh my God.
And that's not an attack on China. It's just a fact that this will help us to use less energy on Earth to provide light at night. So we'd like to put something shiny in the sky. It's a possible thing. So when China does that, okay, you have to ask some people how to do that legally,
A few things there. So first of all, I want to back up when you talk about, or somebody mentioned, ejecting trash into space and using the word trash. I'm influenced, and I don't know all of his vast work, but Buckminster Fuller, the great thought leader, architect, designer, when I think that he says really was no garbage or trash, it's just an undertapped resource. We need to, again, start thinking about like how we can more smartly use what we have, or how to repurpose the things that right now, end up becoming things that we call refuse, just as an aside. And I think one of our greatest stories and challenging stories of our civilization is money. It's a story. It's something it's kind of interesting that an alternate way of calling money is currency. What is currency? It's a form of energy. And we talk about, we have these deep stories. So when it connects with space, right now people are trying to do things they want to get paid. They have things that they want to do, and it requires money. And to get people, they have to sort of have Elon Musk, I'll use him as an example, shares a very convincing story to inspire his employees, his investors, to move things forward. And then he needs vast teams of people like, policy people, engineers, technicians, to make that happen. And they all work currently mostly on the form of currency of money. Now, some of them maybe get, equity options in companies, but that is another way of money. So if there's all this other stuff happening in the space economy, that's not necessarily about people like building things. You've got lots of services. You have people that maybe say they work at a spaceport, whether it's in Mojave, whether it's Spaceport America in southern New Mexico, whether it's the United Kingdom, Cape Canaveral, that are, you might just have a job taking care of facilities management. That's an important job. If you don't keep up the facility, other things can happen. Space requires a lot of it. It's many layers of different types of complexity. It's not just one person inventing in their garage this magical, this seemingly impressive mechanical or engineering device. There's usually a lot of talent behind it.
Yeah, it's a collaborative effort. You can't just be a one person startup shop sending satellites up into space. I want to get back to one of the things that you said earlier, because it was kind of talking about my cat is pushing my computer. Talking about the potential, really, and what space can enable, what the data from space is going to help us all live better lives. And I really can see now, how the data is going to impact so many different industries, logistics and shipping, and smart cities, all of that. But take us on that trip that you were starting to allude to before, of how space is going to make our lives better here.
You just think about it. Let me make sure. Oh, was I on mute? Oh, I thought I was on mute for a moment while I had water. So you can just imagine almost any scenario of yourself in daily life. You step outside and you pull out this amazing device, sometimes a distracting device that has essentially this entire library. It's Star Trek. It's the communicator. We have our earbuds. We are building Star Trek now. It's happening. And this data that's coming from space, you might need to get from point A to B. The space assets are continually making it us, allowing the drivers to get to us more efficiently, allowing the trucks to get to us more efficiently. You say, well, you can't really see what the benefits are. But look, if you say, let's just say before you had to pull out, I'm dating myself, a Thomas guide, which used to be a map book, and you used to have to, thumb through the pages to get there and say, you're like, oh, that's not a big deal. It takes me, say, 2 minutes on average to do that. And you add that 2 minutes up to 365 days a year. And then, you compare that to the time that you save with an app. And then you start thinking about all the different applications, whether it's looking for illegal mining, your day-to-day delivery. It's not just the time saved, which is one component, but other value. We have more resources to preserve our planet. It's probably beyond me to try to quantify it, but I'm sure there are ways to quantify some of this. But it's a return that provides both tangible and intangible benefits. And so you can start taking these scenarios. It's like fishing, forestry monitoring, and let's even go out to things like crazy, like asteroid mining. It's not going to happen yet. They're trying. It's still theoretical. But now, Colorado School of the Mines, a very elite mining program in Colorado, they've now have, I think, a graduate level space resources program. Places, also Australia is becoming a leader of this because they have a lot of mining. They've realized that there's externalized costs to mining here on Earth. And there's talk about mining in the ocean, which is highly controversial and highly problematic because it's just really expensive. And it might even be easier in space in some ways than in underwater. But when you start talking about the externalized invisible and visible costs, pollution and financial to extract these resources to allow us to have these devices, the computers, that come from some of these things. We can get some of these resources in much greater amounts in space. So it's still a little ways out, but we'll start seeing ways to extract those resources for use, so that it'll make it a little bit better here on Earth. But you think about it like a mine. It costs, it can take 10 to 20 years to build, say, a new mine. A lot of money invested, and the investors want some type of return. And there is environmental damage that happens. So if you then start transferring that to saying we can do some of these things in space, and it's a much maybe there's a transference of the environmental impact. If you go to an asteroid, but there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands, not more, of these asteroids. It's completely insignificant to the scale and to the value of what we'll be able to extrapolate. Then having a few asteroids that you're taking essentially little pockmarks from, and doing manufacturing from them, creating fuel from them, getting resources back from Earth. It becomes much more obvious. Did I answer that, Sandra, in a good way?
Yeah. We're going to be out in space mining the asteroids, bringing the iron back here so we don't have to do any seabed mining.
Yeah. I mean, you hear there's like some high level points talked by people like Jeff Bezos, who also has a space company called Blue Origin. And Jeff has said that let's essentially keep Earth, he calls it zoned residential and light industrial, and do heavy industrial for space. And we're not there yet, but that's essentially the idea.
One of the things about the ocean versus space is that it appears, and I don't know the answer to this for sure, but it appears that it is easier for a human to survive long term in space than it is on the ocean. And if you can't stay at the bottom of the Marianas Trench for very long. Like, it's a temporary thing. Where space, we can stay pretty far out for extended periods of time with resources being sent down. When we look at mining, it seems like at some point, if we're able to put robots out, to attach to a rock and, send back ore or whatever it is, it seems like that's going to be a more viable solution. I mean, right now I understand you can take a drill and drive it in the bottom of the ocean and pull out petroleum, which we need, but at some point, we're going to have to go outsource that somewhere else. Is that right?
That's what the energy experts have said. Fossil fuels, carbon-based fuels, are essentially been nature's gift to humanity. It was essentially it's not meant to be used ad nauseum and infinite. If we start thinking about it as it was like this little gift that we should temporarily use to sort of bootstrap us to get to this way where we can get off it, use other energy sources. But humans are we're easily addicted to things.
That's
and
true.
and
I
I think I like sweets too, so I'll leave it there. And I think fossil fuel has been, and we had opportunities earlier to make this transition, and I think we're seeing it now that it's less of a fringe conversation. And so, how does space connect to energy? Well, we're going to be able to eventually manufacture better materials for making things like semiconductors. Some have talked about building massive solar arrays in space. That's not happening yet, but essentially advanced manufacturing in space. Some people have talked about using space-based solar power. A lot of people, there's sort of in the space community, it's pretty divisive. Some people just think we're going to advance quick enough on terrestrial solar power that we won't need space-based solar power. I think you might see in-space solar power where you're beaming between spacecraft and space stations before you see it down to Earth, because I could imagine some countries might not like high energy beaming. It could become a weapon, it could become weaponized, or it could fry something if you don't quite aim it right. But it's an interesting technology. I think the path of looking at the connections between energy and space are worth continued investment in exploring more.
Well, and also our need for energy, petroleum energy aside, the heavy materials, heavy metals, all those things, that's not going down. Like, we consume and waste a lot of things.
We consume more than the Earth currently has. And I talk about this in my book, that we are right now to trend using more Earths than we have Earth. And I try to be thrifty, but I still buy things because I still have to consume certain things just to kind of survive. I need food. There's certain things that, as a privileged Western member of society, I sort of have been opted into, and it's very difficult to opt myself out of. And who am I to say to someone in other lesser advantaged parts of the world that they shouldn't be able to have? And this is just my belief, and this is highly controversial, but who am I to say that they shouldn't be able to have the same conveniences that I have? So I don't want to wreck the Earth, but if there are a way that we can have a higher standard of level, they can have, other individuals can have access to all these things, and we cannot wreck the Earth, I am all for that. And space is part of that equation. And I just think that not enough people have understood that is sort of part of this growing story, that there's a lot of pain going on in the world. I do not want to diminish what is currently going on. We have the luxury of having this conversation right now. There are people that are literally fighting for their lives daily. And I think as we meander through this current pandemic and the other challenges with climate change right around the corner or happening, we need to act fast. And that's a part of the reason why you see entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. You don't have to agree with everything what he believes in or says or how he does things, but he recognizes that humanity right now has a relatively small window to accelerate kind of two parallel things: electrification of things here on Earth in different formats, but call it solar electric transportation as sort of one conduit for that. And the other is the exponentially cheaper cost to space. It having a price to get to space. You used to not be able to you used to have an idea about doing something in space, and finding how much it would cost to do whatever that was almost impossible unless you were a major government contractor, probably already involved in building it, or you were writing the checks and you're like congressional type of leadership or the president. What SpaceX has done is they added a price to flight. And now you can kind of look online and sort of essentially, through a web portal say, oh, this is what it's going to cost. And it's getting more predictable to get things to space. It's still like not, and it's going to get to the point where instead of costing, where it used to cost $10,000 a pound and $1,000, we're going to get towards like just a few bucks per pound. It's really going extremely rapidly. People and people need to recognize that it's here now. And if they're not part of this movement, it's okay. But you could get involved in just thinking about, if there's something you want to create, you're an excellent marketing person, you're an excellent creative. Space needs all that. I alluded to that space, and I'm talking about space as an industry, requires better storytelling. And it's really more about inclusion rather than just a bunch of rocket scientists, because I'm not a rocket scientist. And I am living proof that we can all participate in some type of meaningful way if we want to. And if it's just passing fun to know about, that's cool too. There's no judgment.
One of the things I've been thinking about is, as we start to sort these things out, and we're putting into perspective all of the great minds in the past that have done things. We get a guy like Edison, who was a bit of an asshole, and that's because he didn't tolerate all the other stuff is secondary stuff. I don't care I don't have time for that. And so Elon Musk comes off like that because of the kind of guy that he is, because he's just like, I don't have time to waste with this or that. And he goes forward. The other thing is as these things happen, these other geniuses that you'll never hear of, but they do incredible things. Like someone in our lifetime, someone is bound to come up with the fifth law of thermodynamics, because we're just messing with energy so much. We're going to unlock some new secret, and we'll get past, 0th through 3rd and get a 4th law. And it's going to completely change how we see and understand. That'll be a light bulb moment for all the engineers, and they'll all of a sudden have completely new rules to play with.
So Pete, you and Sandra are both doing incredible things in your individual and collective things. So let's not hand over all of our energy over just to a few of our so-called geniuses. I believe that we each have a lot to, I looked at you, you both are doing awesome, really awesome work. So I think we all have creative, unique geniuses to offer potential new laws of physics. I think there's lots of things in nature that we've not yet been able to measure yet. And it's, we just have to measure and explore things with a level of humility and just understand that there are things we don't know or can't measure yet, but we will, or hope perhaps we will.
Yes, absolutely. Was there anything that we didn't get to touch on that you wanted to talk about, Robert?
Wow, perhaps a lot of things. I mean, maybe a little bragging point is that I was part of a group that helped. We actually flew on a couple of flights of SpaceX. We put on the first solar library, which was a library of 3 books. It was the Isaac Asimov Foundation series inside the Tesla Roadster. So it's now circling the sun. It was part of our installation known as the Solar Library on a technology that will last for billions of years, maybe longer than the actual car. It's, as that car breaks down traveling around the sun. We also had the first installation of the Lunar Library through a group I'm a crew member of called the Arc Mission Foundation. And that's arcmission.org. And we are backing up Earth civilization. And we put a library of over 35 million pages of a vast array of human culture and knowledge on the moon. Now,
that's right. I think we both are a part of that because it was the AI Showbiz.
Yes.
The panels and recordings that made it up there. So, yes, when aliens find that, they'll have a little insight into what we're talking about.
Yeah, we'll have or future robotic anthropologists and archaeologists to help make sense of us. This is part of that. So we're backing up Earth civilization there. So I guess I'd like to just maybe last to share is that I spent a number of years putting together this book that includes contributions from over 100 experts from space and other disciplines, some known and some lesser known, to really smartly tell this story on how people can get activated and understand space, because it is nuanced, it's complex, but it just shares really in hopefully a relatively concise way why it could be the industry that could transform humanity and make us different.
Wonderful. Well, I love this conversation. It's so fascinating. I know we could go on and on and on, but it's just been really enjoyable to hear from you all of the potential that space has to offer, and especially for us here on Earth and the oceans. So yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sandra, for connecting us. And it was a lot of fun, and hopefully we can have future conversations on and offline to keep Earth beautiful.
Absolutely.
And then I want to build a pitch deck, and I want to go to Love's and the Flying J truck stops and start pitching them for the first truck stop in space. Because, those gravity wells, you're going to need a place to get things, maybe DVDs, Elvis pictures, some fuel, all that. It's got to be out there. I'm telling you, there's going to be a commercial place.
Pete, you're actually more on the money than Lowe's or Love's, the Greg Loves and other truck stop people out there would realize. So keep that in mind. In that.